her life of service, we saw that abiding love of tradition, together with that fearless embrace of progress.
Across Britain, tension gathers quietly as familiar rituals take on unfamiliar weight. There is no proclamation, no coronation, only subtle signs that authority is shifting. Windsor feels different, Westminster listens closely, and the country senses something important is already underway without ceremony or announcement yet. The day did not begin with spectacle. There were no trumpets, no formal declarations, no crowds summoned in anticipation of history. Instead, it began with restraint. Windsor, long accustomed to ceremonial rhythm, carried an unfamiliar stillness as senior figures moved with careful precision, aware that attention was sharper than usual. Observers noted the absence of celebration and understood that something more deliberate was unfolding. When William and Catherine appeared, they did so without overt symbolism. There was no announcement of status, no elevation by title. Yet, their positioning told a different story. They did not stand as heirs waiting in reserve. They moved as figures already carrying responsibility, their presence measured, their expressions composed. The reaction among those gathered was immediate, but muted, a recognition rather than a surprise. This was not excitement, it was acknowledgement. Inside Westminster Abbey, the moment that would later be studied in detail passed with deceptive simplicity. Beneath arches heavy with memory, the Archbishop of Canterbury delivered a blessing framed not as reassurance, but as obligation. His words avoided reference to inheritance or lineage. Instead, they spoke of endurance, readiness, and service. Those listening understood the distinction. Blessings of this kind had historically preceded action, not followed it. The weight of that message settled quickly. It was reinforced moments later when Princess Anne stepped forward. Her role was precise, unadorned, and unmistakable. She carried with her a crown newly commissioned, modest in scale, yet rich in meaning. Crafted by a royal jeweler, with centuries of association to the crown, its stones were drawn from collections shaped by past reigns. It did not glitter for effect. It carried continuity. Catherine wore it only briefly. The moment was measured, almost restrained, yet impossible to ignore. Observers remarked on her composure. There was no visible triumph, no display of emotion. She received the symbol as one might accept responsibility rather than reward. The distinction mattered. Within that stillness, perception shifted. By the time the bells rang out across London, the transition had already begun to register. The public response followed swiftly. As William and Catherine arrived at Windsor Castle for a walkabout later, that day the atmosphere had changed. Thousands lined the streets, not to celebrate an event, but to witness presence. Handmade signs spoke of future rather than pageantry. The language was telling. Catherine moved through the crowd with quiet assurance. She listened more than she spoke. Children passed her folded notes. An elderly veteran leaned forward and offered a blessing meant for a queen. Her reply was brief and deliberate, redirecting reverence where she believed it still belonged. In that exchange, restraint carried meaning. Behind palace walls, language was carefully chosen. Aides emphasized continuity. This was not described as a regency, it was framed as shared stewardship. King Charles III, resting under medical supervision at Sandringham, had stepped back from daily duties with deliberation, not weakness. Authority had shifted operationally, even as titles remained unchanged. One absence sharpened the day's significance. Queen Camilla did not attend. Her decision to remain at Raymill House was explained as private reflection. No further detail was offered. The restraint only deepened speculation. Commentators noted that while Westminster had marked a moment, Windsor revealed who now carried momentum. By evening, the symbolism had compounded. William paused beside a memorial oak dedicated to his father and placed a small bouquet at its base. Catherine stood back, watching closely. The gesture was neither farewell nor declaration. It was alignment, loyalty, and leadership held in balance. By nightfall, the prevailing sentiment was difficult to dismiss. The monarchy had not announced change. It had enacted it. Without ceremony, without proclamation, authority had already begun to move. Inside Buckingham Palace, the mood did not mirror the calm seen outside Windsor's gates. What the public received as reassurance, the institution read as signal. Screens replayed the images repeatedly, not for sentiment, but for implication. Princess Anne standing beside Catherine beneath Westminster's ancient arches was no longer viewed as ceremonial choreography. Within those walls, it was interpreted as alignment. Those who study the monarchy closely have long understood that power rarely moves with announcement. It shifts through access, routine, and proximity. In the days following the blessing, these subtle indicators began to change. Communication channels once split between Buckingham Palace and Clarence House were quietly streamlined. Briefings that had traditionally passed through multiple offices were now routed with notable consistency toward Kensington Palace. Official language described the changes as administrative. Observers described them differently. What made the shift unmistakable was not speed, but confidence. There was no visible hesitation, no effort to soften the transition through excess reassurance. Schedules adjusted, priorities realigned. Catherine's public role began to reflect substance over symbolism. Within 48 hours, she hosted a small luncheon focused on youth leadership and education. There were no photographers invited in advance, no ceremonial dress, no attempt to frame the event as historic, yet its implications were clear. This was not preparation, it was execution. International reaction followed closely. British newspapers highlighted the calm authority with which Catherine moved, noting the absence of performance. Overseas coverage focused less on tradition and more on tone. Commentators remarked that the monarchy appeared to be regaining clarity, its focus narrowing toward service rather than display. The contrast was not drawn explicitly, but it was understood. Within the palace, tension lingered. Queen Camilla remained absent from public view. Official statements continued to emphasize support for the king during his recovery. Yet those familiar with palace rhythms noted that absence itself was becoming a presence. Meetings proceeded without her. Decisions advanced without visible consultation. Silence, in this context, carried weight. Meanwhile, Princess Anne's role grew more defined. She was seen moving between residences with purpose, visiting the king regularly, carrying updates rather than seeking permission. Her involvement was unsentimental and precise. When asked whether the recent changes marked permanence, her response was characteristically direct. "The crown," she said, "does not pause for comfort. It responds to readiness." That sentiment echoed through royal circles. William, now chairing key briefings, adopted a restrained but decisive posture. There was no rhetoric of ambition, no suggestion of impatience. His language emphasized continuity and responsibility. Catherine, for her part, appeared increasingly, where duty intersected with humanity. A quiet visit to a children's hospice passed without notice until photographs emerged later. No statement accompanied them. None was needed. Behind closed doors, aides described the atmosphere as disorienting but inevitable. Staff once anchored to Clarence House found themselves reassigned. Some departures followed, others adjusted. One former aide described it simply as the ground shifting beneath familiar structures. Public response continued to reinforce the direction of travel. Polling reflected rising confidence, particularly in Catherine's leadership style. Approval was not driven by novelty, but by recognition. Many remarked that she appeared not elevated, but grounded. Throughout it all, King Charles remained a steady, dignified presence from a distance. Those close to him emphasized resolve rather than retreat. He was said to view the transition not as loss, but as stewardship fulfilled. In one private exchange, recalled by a long-serving aide, he acknowledged that the moment belonged to those prepared to carry it forward. By the end of the week, the language surrounding the monarchy had subtly changed. Commentators spoke less of transition and more of practice. The question was no longer whether authority had shifted, but how long it had already been in motion. The distinction between blessing and coronation began to blur in the public mind, not through decree, but through repetition of action. A blessing, many noted, prepares rather than proclaims. In the language of the monarchy, it signals readiness. What followed in the days after Westminster made that readiness visible. Catherine moved without announcement, yet with increasing clarity of purpose. Photographs surfaced of her leaving the Abbey, not for a formal engagement, but for an unpublicized visit to a children's hospice. No press call was issued, no statement followed. Those present described a quiet exchange, attentive listening, and time given without ceremony. Later that day, confirmation came that she would co-chair the upcoming Commonwealth Youth Forum alongside Princess Anne. The contrast was not stated, but it was apparent. Queen Camilla, by title still consort, remained unseen. Her absence was explained with careful restraint, yet observers began to speak of presence versus position. Catherine appeared where service was most human. Authority, long diffused, was beginning to settle. Those close to King Charles III emphasized there was no bitterness in this evolution. Accounts described resolve and acceptance. In one private moment, recalled by a senior aide, the king spoke quietly with Princess Anne, acknowledging that continuity sometimes requires stepping aside without spectacle. The exchange was brief, unrecorded, and telling. Authority, once shared, delicately, was now aligning with clarity. That alignment became visible during a symbolic walk through the Sandringham estate. William and Catherine met local volunteers who had supported the grounds during the king's recent period of rest. The setting was understated. No formal arrival, no elaborate protocol. Yet the scene carried weight. White roses lined the path. Parish bells chimed faintly. The king did not appear, but his presence was felt in every detail. William and Catherine stepped forward together, dressed simply, their movements unhurried. They paused often, acknowledging the crowd with quiet ease. Catherine knelt to speak with a gardener who had tended the estate for decades. He offered a small bouquet and prayers for the king. She accepted both with care, replying softly that the prayers were felt every day. Nearby, William spoke with young scouts, reminding them that service mattered most when unseen. The exchange was captured without commentary. It did not require interpretation. Inside the main hall, a private reception followed. Senior aides were present, as was Princess Anne. When she spoke, her words were brief. The crown, she said, is not a possession. It is a relay. The message was unmistakable. As evening settled, Catherine convened a small round table with representatives from cultural and diplomatic institutions. The focus was not ceremony, but substance. Education, sustainability, and youth engagement dominated the discussion. Proposals drafted months earlier now moved forward with renewed urgency. Aides confirmed that these initiatives would shape the upcoming Commonwealth Youth Forum. Momentum had replaced anticipation. Media reaction followed swiftly. British outlets described Catherine as the monarchy's moral compass. International commentators highlighted a shift away from spectacle toward purpose, yet within palace walls, unease persisted. Not all were prepared for the pace of change. Some questioned how far the balance had already tipped. At Clarence House, Queen Camilla remained largely out of view. Sources described her days as structured, but inward, reviewing charitable commitments and adjusting to a diminished public role. There was no public commentary, no rebuttal. Silence, once again, carried its own meaning. Meanwhile, reporting lines continued to consolidate. Announcements concerning the Commonwealth Youth Forum came not from Buckingham Palace, but from the office of the Prince and Princess of Wales. The choice was deliberate. Within royal circles, it was understood as confirmation rather than experiment. By the close of the week, a quiet truth had taken hold. Authority was no longer theoretical, it was operational. The monarchy had not declared its future, it had begun to live it. The week that followed confirmed what many had begun to sense, but few were willing to articulate. Authority was no longer circulating, it was settling. Inside the palaces, routines adjusted with remarkable speed, not through announcement, but through habit. Invitations, briefings, and diplomatic correspondence increasingly bore the imprint of Kensington Palace. The change was not dramatic, it was consistent, and that consistency gave it weight. At Clarence House, Queen Camilla remained largely unseen. Those close to her described days spent reviewing charitable portfolios and quietly reassigning advisors. Publicly, the tone remained respectful and restrained. Privately, there was an acknowledgement that the center of gravity had shifted. One long-serving aide described the moment not as exclusion, but as displacement. The work continued, but the influence did not. King Charles III, still resting at Sandringham, received daily updates. Princess Anne delivered them personally, her approach precise and unsentimental. She carried photographs rather than speculation. Scenes from walkabouts and small gatherings where William and Catherine listened more than they spoke. The king studied them carefully. According to one account, he remarked simply that they understood the people, and that understanding mattered now more than ceremony. Soon after, a single official photograph was released. William and Catherine walked hand in hand along a garden path, roses framing the distance, a chapel just visible beyond. The caption was spare, almost austere. Continuity and grace. The response was immediate. European newspapers spoke of a calmer rhythm within the monarchy. American coverage focused on Catherine, portraying her not as a symbol of transition, but as an agent of renewal. Public approval followed the same pattern. Polling reflected confidence rather than excitement. Many described Catherine as a bridge between tradition and tomorrow, someone reshaping the meaning of the crown without challenging its foundations. The approval was notable not for its volume, but for its steadiness. Yet beneath that support, palace insiders acknowledged a quieter reality. The king's recovery was expected to extend longer than initially anticipated. Official language avoided formal definitions, but the structure spoke clearly. Day-to-day authority was now exercised elsewhere. An unspoken understanding had formed, accepted by the king, reinforced by Princess Anne, and sustained through Catherine's measured leadership. For Queen Camilla, this understanding meant remaining present in title while watching symbolic authority move beyond her reach. Her role endured, but the axis had turned. When William and Catherine departed Sandringham one evening under the fading light, the moment felt less like departure than confirmation. A correspondent observing the scene remarked that the crown was no longer waiting for time to pass. It had chosen its moment. Days later, confirmation arrived without fanfare. Catherine and Princess Anne would co-chair the upcoming Commonwealth Youth Forum. The announcement did not come from Buckingham Palace or Clarence House, but from the office of the Prince and Princess of Wales. Within royal circles, the message was unmistakable. This office was now shaping the monarchy's outward voice. For Catherine, the role carried deeper significance. It felt less like appointment and more like culmination. Years of preparation, restraint, and discipline were converging. She personally selected the forum's theme, drafting it late one evening before sending it to Princess Anne. The reply was brief and telling. It was exactly what had been needed. Together, the two women formed a stabilizing axis. Anne, the guardian of duty and continuity. Catherine, the architect of connection and renewal. Preparations reflected that philosophy. Substance replaced spectacle. Panels on education, innovation, and resilience took precedence over formal banquets. Scholars and youth leaders from across the Commonwealth were invited to contribute, not observe. Even the crown itself became part of the message. Confirmation emerged that its lighter version had been crafted with ethical sourcing in mind. Stones donated by Commonwealth nations, recycled materials favored over display. The symbolism was deliberate, understated, and aligned with Catherine's insistence that legacy must be earned, not inherited. As her influence expanded, Queen Camilla's withdrawal became more apparent. Several appearances were postponed. When asked about future engagements, palace responses remained carefully neutral. Within royal circles, interpretation replaced explanation. Against this fragile backdrop, William arranged a private visit to Ray Mill House. It was not announced, it was not denied. Those aware of it understood its purpose. Family unity mattered, even as the institution moved forward. The monarchy was no longer pausing to consider change. It was adapting to it. Quietly, deliberately, and with consequences that were becoming impossible to ignore. The private meeting at Ray Mill House took place without announcement and without witnesses. There were no raised voices, no statements prepared for later release. Yet those familiar with the exchange described it as decisive. William arrived quietly, intent on clarity rather than reassurance. He spoke of continuity, of family, and of a country already adjusting to change. Renewal, he suggested, was no longer theoretical. It was underway. Queen Camilla listened carefully. Her response, offered without bitterness, carried the weight of experience. Renewal, she said, never waits for permission. Those words would later circulate through royal commentary, interpreted less as resistance than recognition. The balance had shifted, and there was no path backward. While that chapter closed in private, Catherine continued to move forward with notable restraint, preparations for the Commonwealth. Youth Forum advanced rapidly, shaped by her insistence that the focus remain on substance rather than ceremony. She declined personal narration in the opening presentation, choosing instead to elevate young voices from across the Commonwealth. The final line, approved personally, spoke of leadership defined by service rather than position. The response was immediate and international. Observers noted the king's reaction. King Charles III watched a preview in private, according to those present, and remained silent for several moments before acknowledging that what he had hoped to begin was now being carried forward with endurance. It was not regret that followed, but acceptance. His legacy, it seemed, would be completed through continuity rather than control. As formal invitations for the forum were issued, Catherine's role crossed an invisible threshold. Diplomatic briefings instructed representatives to accord her full standing in matters of public leadership. There was no proclamation, no ceremony marking the change. Yet within palace corridors, aides spoke in lowered tones about how quickly practice had outpaced language. Princess Anne dismissed the surprise with characteristic clarity. "History rarely announces itself," she remarked. "It moves when the moment arrives." Her partnership with Catherine had become the monarchy's stabilizing force, allowing the king to rest and William to govern without spectacle. Together, they balanced continuity with renewal, maintaining form while redefining function. The forum itself marked the culmination of that evolution. Catherine entered Westminster in an ivory suit, wearing only the lighter crown, chosen not for display, but for meaning. There were no trumpets, no robes, no elevated dais. She spoke briefly, with warmth and precision, addressing belief, responsibility, and compassion as foundations of leadership. The response was unprompted and sustained. That same afternoon, Queen Camilla made a quiet public appearance elsewhere. The timing invited comparison. Catherine commanded global attention. Camilla's visit passed with dignity, but little notice. Those close to her acknowledged the contrast without comment. Silence, once again, spoke clearly. As evening settled, Catherine closed the forum with measured words. "The crown," she said, "exists not to rule, but to remind. Compassion is power, humility is strength." The applause lingered. The following morning, headlines reflected what many already sensed. Leadership had changed shape. At Sandringham, King Charles watched events unfold from a distance. Those nearby said he smiled, moved not by ceremony but by continuity. Catherine was not replacing anyone. She was restoring what had nearly been lost. When winter arrived, the adjustment became unmistakable. Christmas was marked without excess. William and Catherine emerged among crowds with their children, not distant figures but familiar presences. Later that day, they hosted a private gathering for volunteers and families, replacing formal tradition with gratitude. That evening, the king addressed the nation briefly, praising devotion and service as the living heart of the monarchy. Many described it as the closest Britain had come to a voluntary passing of responsibility. As snow fell that night, one truth settled quietly across the country. There had been no coronation, no declaration. Yet authority had already moved. The monarchy had changed, not through announcement, but through action. So what has truly taken place? A calculated strategy, a response to circumstance, or the natural arrival of readiness? And as William and Catherine continue to lead without title, how far will this quiet shift carry the crown? If you found this video valuable, like and share to support the channel. Subscribe for deeper examinations of power, tradition, and change. And click on the screen to continue with our next exploration of how history moves when no one is watching.